Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to this session. I hope you all had an amazing lunch, and I hope you're all energized for this next session, Business Within Planetary Boundaries. My name is Bodie van Stierum. I help event organizers like Change Now create interesting programs, non-boring conversations, and I also help sustainability managers to create sustainability strategies and embed that in their organization. I do that through a freelance collective called The Overview Effect. But today it's my honor to be hosting this session. It's going to be an interesting one, if you ask me, because every leader knows that everything has limits. The economy has limits, their CEO term has limits, and also the natural systems their company relies on has limits. The real question is, which leaders are acting on this knowledge? As humans, we're reliant on fresh water, clean air, healthy soils, and our economies depend on them too. So if these systems are disrupted, it's not only an environmental issue, it's an economic one. As Johan Rockström, who just opened Change Now, he created the Planetary Boundaries framework, and he defined a safe operating space for humanity. Operating within these boundaries is not a question of ideology or choice. It is operating within these limits, is operating just within the laws of what makes life on Earth even possible. So today we're going to focus on the role of business, the role that business can play. It's not only about doing less harm, so emitting less emissions, but it's also about regenerating the systems that we depend on. Somebody that's been rooting for this for decades is Polman. He was former Unilever CEO. He's the author of Net Positive, and he helps business leaders around the world to work on sustainable business and accelerate inclusive business. I was just talking to him. He just came from the US. Last week he was in Mumbai and in China, so he can tell us a lot about how business within planetary boundaries actually looks like in practice. So I want to welcome him to the stage to open this session with me, Polman. Warm applause, please. The Dutch way. As we're both Dutch, we just greeted each other the Dutch way. So, Paul, it's not your first time here on the Change Now stage. You've been here multiple times. How many times have you been here?
Since the beginning, actually. I haven't missed one yet.
Can everybody hear, Paul, since the beginning? No.
Can you hear me?
Maybe we can test the other one.
Is this better?
This is better.
I said, since the beginning, I haven't missed anyone, and I don't want to miss any either.
You don't want to...
It's always great to be in Paris.
Nice. So welcome back to this stage.
Yeah.
We're honored to have you back. And to start, I guess, a bit broader on the term of planetary boundaries, I want to ask you, for those maybe not deeply familiar with the framework, how do you personally interpret these planetary boundaries?
Well, so the challenge for business is not just to decarbonize, which gets a lot of attention, but also really to restore and protect the system that we all depend on. And that's really where the work that Johan Rockström did with the Stockholm Resilience Institute comes in. The overall health of the planet, most people will know, is defined by 9 boundaries. So, you know, water, oceans, forest, etc., atmosphere. And unfortunately, out of these 9 boundaries, 7 of them are what we call beyond the acceptable limit. So the role of the planetary guardians that we have created is not only to bring awareness to that, to be sure that we start to take decisions that actually lead to staying or returning into these planetary boundaries. And one of the major drivers, obviously, is the private sector, which is 60, 70% of the economy, 80% of the financial flow, 90% of the job creation. So we need to be sure that it gets the attention it deserves, and that's really what the planetary boundaries, what the planetary guardians are trying to do. We have a request, for example, to have in each of the governments a planetary scientist, chief planetary scientist. Very important for us that all the government decisions are taken ideally within this framework of planetary boundaries. We are able to measure where each country is on that journey to see if the gap is bigger or if the gap is being closed. We're looking at financing mechanisms. We need about $1.3 trillion a year for emerging markets. Right now, less than 50 billion goes in that direction. In fact, most of the money spent is destructive, not restorative. So these are the type of things that we're trying to do to get it higher on the agenda and hopefully move it forward a little faster.
So the framework really much helping to have the conversation, because it is nothing new, right? That we know.
No, it's nothing new, but you need to put it together because there's so many, it is far more complex than just saying I do climate change and we need to reduce my carbon emissions. Yeah. But it's like human health. We look at blood pressure, we look at heart health, we look at weight. There are about 10 variables that a doctor looks at to see how healthy are you. And that's not different for the planet. So we have to get used to that. And it's not just biodiversity alone. There are obviously conventions, the 30 by 2030, or the climate change conventions, the COP, the oceans. This actually puts it holistically together in one framework. Very powerful.
Yeah. And if we look at those 7 of 9 boundaries already breached, like what does that mean and require for leaders today? Because they obviously have to do something different.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So the most important thing for business is that they get first of all familiar with the science and understand what it means for their business models. Many businesses are, I would argue, most, if not all businesses, depend on the health of our planet. We breathe the same air, we drink the same water, we eat the food from the land. And if that health is in such a precarious state, we all pay the price for it. So if you run a business, the first thing you want to do is to find out how much you depend on the resources, if you want to, or the services that are provided by our natural systems. You want to measure those. Second thing you want to do is you want to look at your total value chain and take the impact for that and start to measure that. The third thing you want to do is set goals that are in line with science. Don't set goals that you can get away with. Too many businesses play not to lose. They should really start playing to win. That's and above all is change the mindset that an improvement is not necessarily enough. If you have overshot 7 of these 9 planetary boundaries, being less bad is still bad. I used to kill 10 people, now I only kill 5. I'm not a better murderer. So we need to get people to think in business model terms, to be regenerative, restorative, reparative. And that's the most difficult step. But companies that are starting to do that see clearly the benefits. The beauty of nature is that an investment in nature actually has a fast and high return. So companies that understand that start to protect their natural capital, are better positioned for the future, also better valued by the market.
And is that then the benefits that you're talking about? Like what would be other examples of those benefits?
Well, so if you, so ultimately the benefit is that your company is more resilient and better valued. If you don't show that the economics work for you in this environment, it's very difficult. You need to be very tangible and show that your business is stronger. And I think there's enough evidence of that. But your value chain is more resilient. Your people are more motivated. You have more trust. Trust is low in business. So if you're a solution provider, what we would call net positive, more likely you'll be higher on the trust scale. We looked at some companies this morning. Regretfully, they're always the same names. But these companies are doing very well and they have a high level of trust because they proactively want to make this a better world. They don't want to just stop by making it less bad. So the ripple effect you get out of this is enormous. And most of the value of a company that's created nowadays, it's not in its assets or in its, it's in its factories or in its offices. It's actually in the goodwill and the trust So it's a very good investment from that perspective.
Yeah. And you work a lot with business leaders, obviously, across the world.
Yes, yes.
And you just told me that you traveled all the way from the US and you were in Asia a few weeks ago. I'm curious where you see that that change breaks down, because you were talking about learning and changing your business models. Like, where do you particularly see that change, doesn't really happen? Where does it stagnate?
Well, so there's a little bit of a dichotomy. On the one hand, you have a big discontinuity in AI. You have a big discontinuity in geopolitics. You have a big discontinuity in planetary guardians. In planetary boundaries. So you would expect that that would be enough of an impetus for business. Nearly every business has to dramatically change and change its portfolio. Unfortunately, what is happening, and that's just the reality of the moment, is that everybody gets pulled down to the here and now, where you just have to open your newspaper every day. There's another surprise of a supply chain disrupted, of a war breaking out, of a natural disaster that you need to cater to. So we see on the one hand a higher awareness of the drivers that require discontinuous change, but at the same time we see a behavior that pulls you back. Then on top of that, you also have some governments that obviously are more interested in protecting the status quo than in advancing in the direction we all know that we need. And that causes a certain level of fear. So this is a time where we have more knowledge than we've ever had in the history of mankind. This is a time where we have more tools to do something about it. This is a time actually that we have the technologies that are proven for 80–90% of the issues that we are talking today, Bodine. And this is also a world that has enough money actually to deal with it. We just need to put it in the right direction. So what we actually need at the end of the day is that leadership. If we don't have that leadership, we will never get there. So I spent a lot of time with CEOs, with collective action, to overcome some of that inertia that is in the system right now.
Yeah. And that inertia, like, how do you go about that? Because it's also, I guess, people with vested interest used to the status quo. And I guess it's the most difficult to change. Like, how do you go about leaders that have inertia?
Yeah, it's the most difficult to change, because to me, a striking example was the World Economic Forum issuing every year the top 10 risks. And what you now see is challenges to our planetary boundaries is still being seen as a big risk, but it's 10 years out. All of a sudden, the risk right now is geopolitical tension and some other things. I understand that, but climate change, biodiversity destruction, is creating havoc already here and now. It's not a thing that you can kick down the road. So the first thing you need to do is to be sure that people understand the science and make that simple for them. As I mentioned, if they don't understand the science and don't understand how it affects their companies, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Then you have to work on the internal level of a CEO as well as the external levels. Internal levels means, what's your purpose? Why are you here? What's the reason for your business? Are you here to solve problems and profit from that, or are you here to create problems and profit from that? I know on which side I want to be. And then you have to go fairly quickly nowadays to not to the lofty promises or the big statements, but the tangible actions, and make sure that that works economically as well. And that's actually not so difficult if you put your mind to it, increasingly so.
And we talked shortly, you touched upon the role of governments. I'm also curious, what do you see as the biggest levers we should be pulling right now? Because you touched upon governments and the role businesses have to play, and also just finance. What are the levers you really think should be pulled right now?
So the easiest and the immediate leverage is there is still $1.8 trillion of per-force subsidies that governments put in place that actually destroy nature. The investments we put behind nature protection and restoration is only about 50 billion. In fact, business itself is spending probably about 5 trillion destroying nature right now. So the first one is to move to these per-force incentive systems into the right direction. That's why I say it's not really a question of needing more money, it's redirecting the money where it's most effective in this case. Yeah. The second thing you need to do is bring science really to the foreground. If we don't let science guide us, then we really have a hard time protecting the truth. Why you see in some countries the attack on science is because it's hard to defend. So the role of the planetary guardians is to bring that science forward. The third thing is, Johan Rockström is talking about that quite often, we are already seeing some negative tipping points. So we need to protect these hotspots that have a multiplier effect. So for example, the Amazons, the tropical forest of the Congo, the Indonesia. So the mechanisms like the Tropical Forest Forever Fund, if we can get that off the ground, to pay people for protecting nature-based services is a very important thing to do, and I think that's important. Yeah. And then finally, we need to work at a global level to get for more or less the $1.3 trillion of money that is needed for emerging markets to support all the things here. Yeah. If we don't have the financial means, provide people with better livelihoods, take care of areas that are fallen behind for behavior that is elsewhere in the world, we won't get there. So we do need that as well. So these are probably the levers. And then last but not least, you need to get the private sector behind it at scale, and that's where I'm focused on.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that in the panel we will also be talking to Thomas from ING, so we can talk deeper about the capital part.
Ask him where the 1.3 trillion comes from.
where the 1.3 trillion comes from.
Yes, how much he finances of that.
We'll ask that.
Good.
And lastly, because you were talking about the Planetary Guardians, we didn't even touch upon that, but you are active within that organization.
Well, we created it. I'm the vice chair. Hindu Ibrahim is the chair right now. I chair the vice chair with President Santos, former president of Colombia, Mary Robinson, Christiana Figueres, Johan Rockström, many of the people, Sylvia Earle, the late Jane Goodall. These are all planetary guardians. A network of about 20 people right now, growing very fast. Carlos Noble from Brazil, an incredible climate scientist, and the list goes on. So we're working quite actively with governments to be sure now what the Dutch and the Colombians sponsor, for example, to get for the countries of the willing to attack climate change. So how do we get the science on the agenda and ensure that we move in the right direction? And that's what the Planetary Guardians do. Call it not only the voice of consciousness, but more importantly, the voice of action, and that's what's needed right now.
And our time is already up, but I was really curious. We're going into this panel with Sandrine, Fabrice, and Thomas. Is there anything that you're like, you have to ask them this question that you would be very interested in from the capital side, or the systems change work that Sandrine is doing? Is there anything that I should ask them as a moderator?
Well, it's a great panel with incredible people, so I'll be listening quite intensively to that. But ultimately, we won't get there, really, if in this environment we don't have the right frameworks and policies in place. So it's good for a lot of businesses trying to do more, and we all need to do more. Business needs to internalize these challenges, get it at the board level, set the targets, all the things we talked about. But ultimately, we don't get there if you swim against the tide. And we see an incredible reluctance now at a global level. And so how do we overcome that challenge, which is not an easy one, to be honest, and we all struggle with that. And I just came from the US, and there was a No King's Day march, and there's millions of people on the street. So how do you, and politicians respond to the people that vote for them. So how do you make that possible from a top-down approach where we're sitting, but at the same time I recognize more than any perhaps that you need these movements on the ground. So that's a great area to get the panel's opinion on.
Nice. And also the policy part, Sandrine can talk about that
without any doubt.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for opening this session with me, and we'll move on to the panel. A warm applause for Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. We have to get some extra chairs in, and then we'll be ready for the panel. Thank you. So we just heard of Paul's view on planetary boundaries. And it's interesting to make that even more specific, more concrete, to talk to multiple business leaders and also a system change leader. So I think it's an interesting combination of more a macro perspective and maybe a bit of a smaller perspective throughout two companies. I want to welcome to the stage Thomas Lavergère, CEO from ING France. Fabrice Barthélémy, CEO Target. Here you go. And Sandrine Dixson-Declève. Welcome to the stage. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I'm sitting on the... It's okay. Sandrine won't bite. I'm very happy to have you all here on stage with me today. I'll do a very short introduction of these three people sitting next to me because we want to have those full 26 minutes to talk about these questions that we have here. So shortly, Sandrine, you're the honorary president at the Club of Rome. As I said before, we talked about that you work on a lot of policy pieces as well for the EU. You're traveling around the world to help business leaders to do sustainable business. And I think it's a great perspective to have here in the panel. Fabrice Barthélémy, you're CEO at Target, which is a flooring and sports surface solution company, and so a manufacturer. And we have Thomas Lavergère, CEO ING France. These two men just came from their offices here in Paris, so a home game. I think Sandrine had to travel a bit longer, but I'm very...
Even longer than you think. I just came from Beijing last night.
Oh, you just came from Beijing last night. That's even longer than I thought it would be. So today we're talking about business within planetary boundaries. I think Paul has set some context already, and we're going to sort of deepen that out a bit more through a few questions. So I want to start with you, Fabrice. Because what does it mean to operate within planetary boundaries for your organization? And to make that more specific, where can you already see it in your strategy?
I think, Bodine, the first word that comes to mind for me is humility. Because, you know, at Target, we make flooring surfaces, we make sport surfaces, all that made from polymers, primarily from polymers. So don't expect me to have to come with ready-made solutions. I think we really feel deeply that we have a duty to redesign our products, to redesign the way we source the materials, to redesign the way we make them and we distribute them. But really the first word about that is about humility.
Humility. And where do you see sort of, I guess, those conversations that are going on in your organization, where do you see it back in your strategy? Because we also talked about, like, are you focusing on water? Are you focusing on carbon? Like those earth limits, do you see them back in your strategies?
Absolutely, yeah. Because the first focus we've had for many years now is about carbon, about reducing our own Scope 3 carbon footprint and the one of our customers. So we design and we promote products, services that last longer, that reduce the carbon footprint of our customers. More and more, we focus also about water. For example, we make artificial turf. So artificial turf is made of plastics, made of polymers. But when you replace a natural grass field, soccer field, by artificial turf, you save millions of liters of water just to water the grass. You save tons of fertilizers, and the overall, actually, balance of all that is in favor of carbon footprint. So that's why the immediate solution, you would say plastic is not good, but actually plastic is better than pouring lots of water in the south of California to maintain a natural grass field.
Okay, so that's the view of Target on operating within those limits. And Thomas, what is ING doing to operate within the limits that we've also been talking about in the opening?
Well, ING being a Dutch bank, it happens that in the Netherlands, 1/3 of the territory is under sea level. So we have indeed planet boundaries within our own DNA, and we have been working around how to be as efficient as possible in accelerating the transition for the last 10 years. And it proves to be an exciting but damn challenging road. It happens that ING is the bank which invented the sustainable finance. We are the first bank having a strategy to decarbonize our lending portfolio, which is validated by science, by SBTi. And we are fully engaged with our customers to accompany them as a demanding and engaged partner to decarbonize their business model. But let's face it, it is indeed very challenging. Why? Because it requires very much to sacrifice for most of the economic actors some short-term profit for long-term economic value. And transition has a cost which is required to maintain the long-term value of our assets, but it does have a cost. And so it's critical to align all stakeholders, including banks, investors, citizens, consumers, to make the pain of this transition shared in a fair and equitable manner. And that's what we are trying to do
And how do you do, as in how specifically do you do that? Because does ING play a role in making that a fair transition?
Let me give you a couple of examples. One of the challenges we need to address is to develop sustainable infrastructure. Sustainable infrastructure in energy, in transportation, in digital, fiber, data center. And for many of those transactions, the risk-reward equation for an investor or for a creditor like ING as a bank is not as compelling as in the old economy without any planet boundaries. And we have to accept a risk-reward equation which is slightly less attractive to make the transition happen and accelerate the reallocation of capital. And that's what we are doing when we retrofit petrochemical complex, in the south of France. That's what we are doing when we finance turbine for NG, or that's what we're doing when we develop fast charging stations for the mobility company Electra.
Yeah, some specific examples, and I'm interesting because this is all from the perspective of your organizations. Sandrine, you are sitting on multiple boards at the moment. You're working on legislation, so I think you can give us a bit of a macro view, a more of a systemic view, and I would love for you to reflect a bit on what the role of a manufacturer and a financial institution like ING is in sort of working towards an economy within limits.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank also Paul, my dear friend, because Paul is and Unilever was one of the first businesses, as well as Interface, by the way, in the area of carpets, and so many other, Danone and other companies that joined us 15 years ago when we started the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group with King Charles. So we have to remember that there have been progressive businesses and banks that have been on this journey from the very beginning. And so I want to start with that. My other reflection is I started my career putting in place site management systems and chemicals legislation and being in the nitty-gritty of manufacturing sites already 30 years ago. We cannot forget that Europe was the leader and hopefully will continue to be the leader in setting regulation and rule of law for companies based also on deep stakeholder engagements. So I want to bring that in as a reminder as we often see that we're going back in terms of ESG. We see that we've got pushback in terms of many parts of our climate legislation, that Europe until now has been a leader in this area. But what is lacking is that systemic perspective, and that's what I want to get to. What is lacking is that with all of the progressive companies, and even the incredible CEOs, they are constrained by their shareholders. It is the shareholders that are dictating the profits that are coming from the companies, as well as the short-term cycles, which Paul so long ago already asked to change. So I think we are constrained by the economic and the financial system. We have an over-financialized economic system that is only looking at shareholder value. And that is what my learning has brought me to after 35 years of career working with policymakers, putting in the regulation, working with companies in implementing the regulation, is that if we do not shift this over-financialized economy that is dictated by profit for the few, not for the many, especially now when we're in the midst of a tech-bro feudalistic push from the United States, where the winner takes all, we will never stay within the planetary boundaries. That is the reality. So what does that mean? That means that collectively, with these brave men, collectively with the brave men and women that are right now struggling inside their companies because they're being told to move backwards when they were sustainability officials or sustainability heads, that we need to come up with a plan. We have to out-strategize. And part of that out-strategy, having just been with Johan, and I will complete with this, is that we were just at Orazeo, where I sit on their advisory board. They have set up one of the first planetary boundary funds. And Johan has been working, as many others, on the cost of inaction. The cost of inaction on climate change is that at 1.5 degrees, we lose 3% of GDP, at least. And that's now. And if we go further to 2050 and we hit 3 degrees, we could lose upwards of between 10 to 17%, depending on how vulnerable you are. That is our key selling point, is that we are in the midst of economic instability. We are going to lose GDP if we don't buffer GDP with other indicators that take into consideration the planetary boundaries.
Is that a conversation that within Tarkett, also with shareholders, is that something that the conversation is having?
But I am blessed, Sandrine, because I have worked for a family-owned company, and my board supports everything we do for the long run. And they are not obsessed with dividends or with short-term. Of course, they want performance, but they are not obsessed absolutely by dividends. One thing I wanted to say is that it's true that we have a lot of regulation, but still there are lots of gaps. For my customers in Europe, in most cases, it is cheaper to incinerate products at the end of their use than to send them to me for recycling. And that's because there's no, the taxes on incineration are not enough. That cost is not big enough to be at the same level as the cost of taking back products to recycle them. So it's a complex topic as well, and I wouldn't give up on regulation, really.
I agree with this, by the way. May I just say that I love the family offices and the small and medium-sized enterprises that still can think about the long term and not just the short-term gains.
Yeah, we also had a conversation previously with Longchamp. There's also a family-owned business, and it's just such a different way at looking at their business. Would you want to elaborate a bit, build upon that?
Maybe just to react to what Sandrine was saying, which is quite critical to understand the reasons why we are late in this transition. We are late in terms of volume of investment and in terms of celerity of those investments, exactly for the reasons that Sandrine mentioned, which is an increasing focus around short-term gains versus long-term prosperity. And we need every one of us at our own level, in our organizations or our citizens, to try to make the ecosystem more able to reconcile transition and prosperity, and they obviously need together, and they work together. What we see in Europe and in France in particular is that the infrastructure funds, and we have some very strong French infrastructure funds like the Infravia, the Vauban, the Meridiam, the Mirova of the world, those have a long-term view at the economy. And when you have a long-term view at your investment, then naturally you do what is right for the planet because you are focused on the residual value of your assets. When you are a pension fund, you have naturally a long-term view at your investments and act the same way. For all of us as actors in the economy, to convince the rest of the investment community to relax a little bit about the short-term profitability driver and focus more on the long-term value. But this is the key challenge and the key explanation on the reason why we are behind. The other element that you mentioned, Sandrine, is around regulation. And regulation is key. I would just mention three which to me are high on our agenda. Number one, the carbon price. We do not have today, in the way we reflect profitability, carbon price in the P&L of economic players. We need to think and act to achieve that. Second, the CSRD regulation change.
Sandrine knows a lot about the CSRD.
Brings simplification, which is welcome. But unfortunately, we need data collection to be able to reflect on the transition challenges and allocate our capital accordingly. And last point I would mention is around thermal transition, where we did relax the rules around the thermal transition of 2035. We understand the logic behind it, but let's face it, pushing back the necessary investment for the transition will not make the task easier. No. We need to accelerate rather than slowing down.
You also said relax, that we don't only focus on the short term. Is that your message for the financial world, I would say?
Correct.
Sandrine, I'm curious because Thomas shortly touched upon prosperity, and a question that we previously discussed last week when we were chatting, like how do we keep creating prosperity when we can't keep using more and more of Earth's resources, which did create our prosperity and is creating our prosperity? How do you view that question?
I think there are different aspects of this, and it is incredibly complex. I think the first conversation we have to have is how do we shift our growth patterns in Europe and consume less while we enable, because we know, I just came from, as I said, China, and China has, by the way, a growth plan of doubling growth to 2040. And yet, they are the leaders in decarbonization right now, even though they continue to invest in coal. Part of that prosperity game is figuring out how we can optimize our economy and address efficiencies. We are so inefficient in many of the ways in which we actually lead our economy, because it's based on productivity instead of actually looking at optimization. But I think the other, in terms of that prosperity, is that what we've realized is this is the first year where actually human progress is going backwards. This obsession with growth and thinking that growth means prosperity is absolutely flawed. We have more people now that are actually under the poverty line than we've ever had before, not going all the way back before the Second World War, but definitely in terms of the last 3 generations since the Second World War. We have the highest rates of mental illness, the highest rates of suicide. In Europe, youth suicide has just surpassed accidents in terms of death rate. So I think it's very important, even though we have the highest quality of life in Europe, that we think about what does prosperity mean. And so we've translated prosperity to well-being economics. Well-being economics means that you start to value your economy and a thriving civilization on access to healthcare, on access to education, on ensuring that everyone has a decent quality of life. And I'll finish again with this coming just now from China. And yes, there are issues with the Chinese way. But one thing I've learned is that because of the long-term planning, for example, on the financial side, it is now anchored into the law that finance is to help people thrive, not just survive, and it's not for the few, it is for the many. Sustainable finance is actually continuing through the taxonomy, etc., whereas our omnibus on sustainable finance and reporting has just been obliterated. But most importantly, governments in the provinces, if pollution goes up and if people's lives are made worse, their salary goes down and they are penalized. We need to think about this as a way in which we move forward. Again, I'm not saying that an authoritarian way is the right way.
No.
But I do believe we can learn from some of parts of the Chinese way.
Yeah, and you touched upon that we are not efficient. What would efficient look like to you?
Well, partly efficient is to go back upstream, all the way upstream, and reduce consumption. I mean, we have to stop thinking that the material goods are going to, first of all, make us more prosperous or make us happier. In Europe, we're no longer talking about prosperity in some cases. We're talking about ownership of materials rather than actual real prosperity.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. But of course, you know, energy efficiency is actually the best mechanism for moving forward alongside renewables. The best energy is the energy you don't use.
Yeah.
And we've forgotten about that.
And I'm curious because we're talking about materials, and we obviously know the current geopolitical tensions, for example, in the Middle East. Fabrice, does that even impact, or I guess it impacts, but I'm curious to hear from you, does it impact the ability to operate within the planetary boundaries, particularly when it comes to energy security and stable supply chains?
Yes, of course. And I mean, you talk about geopolitical tensions, which is it's a very nice word. Actually, it's war. And we have colleagues in many parts of the globe now that live under war and in the fog of war. So I think we should never forget that. If there is one good thing about this situation, I think it makes everyone realize how dependent we are on physical flows of products, materials, and energies. I know many CEOs have become an expert in all the ports of the Middle East, how to ship products from Abu Dhabi or Jeddah to back to Europe. And it makes us realize how important that is to us. And it makes us realize that it is crazy. We need to redesign the way we are sourcing or not sourcing products, and how much we are actually trying to recycle, reuse, and reduce the volume of energy and materials that we use.
Yeah, because I guess on the other hand, it can also strengthen the case for renewables and, as you said, circularity.
Absolutely.
And because we maybe have to look at recycled materials and local energy instead of being reliant.
It does, and it will. You know, a month and a half ago, we are still investing in recycling or reuse, because reused materials, reused carpet tiles, they cost more than new ones, just because of the logistics and so on. And there is demand for that. But with the sudden increase in raw material prices, this makes these business models actually much more viable. So long term, I think it's a good thing. Short term, it's a disaster for everyone that's involved, and for the people in India and Asia who are going to starve very soon. Huh?
I'm curious for your reflection on that, Thomas.
Yeah, unfortunately, the situation in the Middle East, 4 years after the invasion of Ukraine, validates the utmost priority we need to give to the energy transition and to the need of moving away from fossil fuel. Let's face it, 80% of the economy today is dependent on fossil fuel. So we need to do this in an inclusive way and work as we are doing with our clients as a partner for the business models to evolve and to be based on a sustainable source of energy. And this fight of climate transition becomes clearly a fight for the economy and for the sovereignty. The key critical competitive pillar of an economy is the access to energy, which we need in a way which is secured, competitive pricing-wise, and decarbonized, not to be dependent on fossil providers. And that's exactly what remains to be center of the transition of the economy, not for ethical value, but for some true economic value and for sovereignty reasons. This is the way for us to gain our independence and to become more competitive tomorrow than we are today.
And with that in mind, so the competitiveness, are you hopeful we as humanity can even stay within those limits? As like where we're creating prosperity at the moment, as you're doing business currently, are you hopeful we can stay within those limits?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful, and I'm sure that most of the audience is very hopeful. I mean, as we heard from Professor Nordstrom, the dice are not tossed yet. You know, the future is in our hands for change still to happen and to create the prosperity that we want to create. The real difficulty for all of us is that we need to create a new societal model where we don't have consensus yet. And so how to embark the majority of us to create this new society and new equilibrium. It's a fascinating ambition for all of us to make it a successful journey.
To close off, I want to give you the last remark, Sandrine.
Thank you. You know, we've done a survey of G20 citizens. And I think that what Thomas is saying is really important, because we have to create that alternative future. They need to envision what that future is. For the moment, they don't. They only see the conflict. They see the pain. They see inequality. They see that actually their lives are getting worse, not better. And of course, in particular, the radical right is using decarbonization as an excuse to say that prices are going up and therefore we should go backwards, and use that as a competitiveness issue as well as an affordability issue. So first, we need to hack the myths, and I think that's very important. But secondly, let's go back to that survey. That survey was of G20 citizens, including the Chinese and Europe and the United States. 70% approximately of citizens across the G20 fundamentally believe that we need a new economic model. The same amount want to go towards a well-being model. The same amount believe in tipping points, both social and environmental. But however, 39% do not trust their governments anymore. Who can they trust? They need to trust scientists, but they need to trust business leaders to start making human choices. And so I think that our collective call, and by the way, hope is not some kind of fluffy thing, huh? Hope is about grit. Hope is about moving forward. Hope is about courage. Don't just sit there and think that we're all going to go back and make the change for you. We all have to make that change together. We have to fight together like those that were in the streets and actually put their lives at risk this weekend to say that they don't believe in a king. We cannot allow for our European leaders to start to move in that direction. So I think it's very important as we talk about the planetary boundaries that we realize that we are stepping backwards also in terms of our own humanity and our own leadership at this time. Here in Europe, I speak to you as an American and a European. Let us make sure that we translate hope into change.
Thank you, Sandrine. I wanted to give you the last remark. You're great at inspirational speeches. Thank you to Thomas. Thank you to Fabrice to hear also from the business perspective. What I really got from this was also, as Paul touched upon, believe in the science and communicate the science. And also, how are we going to go to showing people what the other future look like an over-financialized system, what does the alternative look like? And I think we also have to be amazing storytellers to let that come across. Thank you so much, and we're going to close this session with Ariane. Thank you. To close this session and to ground this into the data that we're seeing out in the world, I want to welcome to the stage Ariane Coulombe from CDP. It's hard to change what you can't measure. And that's exactly what CDP does. CDP is on a mission to shape and deploy the world's most comprehensive and valuable environmental disclosure database. And today with me here is their market director EMEA, Ariane Coulombe. Then we can do a warm applause for Ariane.
Thank you. I should have brought my sunglasses.
Yeah, we should have brought our sunglasses. That would have been a nice here.
Everyone looks very cool
Maybe
with
we
their
get a
sunglasses
tan.
in the crowd.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
Thank you for joining me here. And as I said, I think we talked a lot about leadership and systems that need to be changed, but I want to ground this conversation in the data. What are we seeing in the numbers? And I think you're the perfect one to enlighten on that a bit. So I want to ask you, so CDP is the world's only independent environmental disclosure system. So since I think the 2001, they've gained a lot of environmental data. They know exactly how companies are moving forward, who are the laggers. And I'm curious, what do you do with all that data that's being disclosed by companies? What is the value that CDP creates?
I mean, I can tell you what we don't want to do with it, right? So what we don't want to do with it is that it ends up being somewhere in a drawer that nobody's looking at and just gathering dust. And basically, the whole effort that so many people are doing to actually do the data collection is in the end just for nothing. So that's the main mission that we're trying to do, is to make sure that that data is actually put to good use. And for that, you need to understand what the how is, essentially. So data for the sake of collecting data doesn't make sense. You have to understand what the problem is that you're trying to actually solve for, so that you can engineer what the data points that you need for concrete action actually look like. So it's about creating an understanding of what the problem is, instead of just collecting data points for the sake of collecting data points.
And if you're talking about good use, what would be an example of CDP putting their data to good use?
Yeah. So basically, companies have a choice. We were talking, the previous panel was just talking about short-term gains versus long-term. And humans are also not programmed to actually think long-term. It's going against our nature in a way to actually think in the long term. And when you think from a company's perspective, your CEO has two options. You can say, okay, I think about climate change, nature loss, all these issues. I can take this seriously, I can look at the data, and I can implement change based on the data, or I can just wait and see. Which I feel like we don't have so many, that's not really a way to do business, to just wait and see. And so for an organization, for a company, you can look at, on the one hand, securing your license to operate is actually taking those data points into consideration and creating a strategy, creating a structure within your organization for long-term growth and long-term success that is actually looking at those risks, but also looking at the opportunities that also lie in this data, whether that's developing new products, entering new markets, also attracting talent. So many people now want to work for an organization that actually cares about these topics. And now in Europe, we're in a talent shortage, and so actually making sure that those people are attractive and want to join your organization is one of the numerous opportunities that lie within the data.
Interesting. So when companies fill in, like the CDP assessment, they exactly know where their gaps are on water, on biodiversity, on forests. So they get a lot of insights into where they should focus on, I guess. Is that an example of how it works after they fill it in?
Essentially. So what we can also think, so what CDP's been asking these questions essentially before the CSRD, before these questions were actually being asked by various parts of economic stakeholders. And you can see within this historical data what the companies that are actually making progress against their goals, what do they have in common? So what are the things that they do to actually be able to make progress against the targets that they're setting themselves? Because what we're seeing right now is an increasingly high number of companies actually setting targets, but there's still an implementation gap between setting those targets and actually, making progress against them. And there are a few things that, when you look at this, long list of data points that we've been gathering for a very long time, you can see what the companies that are actually making progress on those targets have in common. One very clear one is where sustainability is actually integrated within their corporate structure. So we saw here CEOs on the stage that were taking climate change seriously. That's not necessarily the case for every single organization. And seeing that those topics make it all the way to the board level is one thing where, of course, if the highest levels of your organization take these topics seriously, you're more likely to see change down the line.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that you can see, okay, the companies that are actually making progress on those targets are the ones that are including sustainability in a very holistic way in their organization. At the same time, they're also the ones that are attaching management incentives to achieving those goals. So again, having someone care about it beyond just having it their daily work.
Yeah.
And there are countless other examples of what those leading companies are actually doing.
And I guess that's a great example of also really changing the structures people work within, because you cannot also hope a company will change if you don't change the systems that people work in. And I'm curious, if you look at, I guess, the laggers and the front runners, like, what do you see in the data? What is the biggest sort of barrier for organizations to take a first step on these topics that you measure through CDP?
I mean, it's a broad question, because there are a lot of different reasons why people kind of wait to take the first step. In Europe, in general, we're a pretty mature market when it comes to climate data. When it comes to nature-related data, there's still a very, very long way to go. But I think there is an increasing understanding that to have a proper climate strategy, you can't omit topics like water, like biodiversity, and look at them together in a holistic way. I think in many cases we also let perfection become a bit the enemy of the good. Is that the expression? I think so.
Yes, that is completely correct.
Which is saying, what I hear sometimes from organizations is, I don't have any water data. We're not collecting this data. I don't have any biodiversity data. I don't really know. And therefore, I'm not going to actually build out a strategy. But I mean, you're not going to start a strategy if you don't actually start collecting the data on those topics. So waiting, we don't really have the time to wait for this. So what I would advise is to really start with, okay, what are maybe the central data points that you need, and then start somewhere, and hopefully that will also lead to action sooner than later.
And I think it also touches upon what Paul said about leaders having inertia, maybe like, okay, we just don't have the data, so where do we start? So I think that's a great tip, to just start collecting data. I guess CDP can also help with that, right? Taking that first step.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And if we look at the past 10 years, because CDP has had data since 2000, the year 2000, so I'm really curious, have you seen as the biggest changes in the past 10 years in terms of companies moving forward? Since, I guess, the Paris Accord, that was around 10 years ago.
I mean, I had mentioned earlier, right, we're seeing an increasing number of market capitalization that's being covered under a climate target, but there's still a big gap when it comes to implementation. And that's where everyone kind of, I think I told you this when we were chatting earlier, that I was at a different conference and the moderator asked the room, okay, who in this room has a climate target for 2030? And the whole room raised their hands, and then they asked, okay, how many people are actually on track to achieve it? Yeah. And half the room put their hands down.
Okay, we won't ask that question here.
We won't ask this question here, but I mean, it's just the reality in which we're operating is that it's one thing to set a target, it's another thing to actually change your business model, to actually be able to make progress and make real change, and that's a huge task ahead, and that's why it's so important to set concrete plans, and that's one thing that we didn't see 10 years ago is actually climate transition plans, 1.5 degree aligned climate transition plans. Also organizations engaging with their supply chain much more than they used to, where the majority of their emissions and their impact actually lies usually in their supply chain. Yeah, is something that now we're also seeing the demand for these data points increase as well.
And you, I guess, obviously have a lot of conversation about plans and data. Paul also touched upon the human side and the mindset shift. I'm just curious, do you often have conversations about that too, or is it because you're so close to that data that it's mostly focused around that?
Yes. So I think what surprises me also being here and being at Change Now also last year, and also in my conversations with CEOs, is that the language that they use has changed. That's true. So the language, also the education piece, like the topic of climate change has reached the boardroom, albeit still in a very specific way. And there's a long way to go to actually create this shift in thinking that also, I mean, Sandrine was talking about it, right? Is sustainability, and when you talk about sustainability, it's not just climate change, it's not just nature loss, it's also a full different way of operating within our economic system.
Yeah. Interesting. So it obviously goes broader than that. I have a closing question for you. We're going to look ahead. If we fast forward 5 years, what will investors, regulators, and society expect from companies that they don't demand yet today?
So one thing that we're hearing a lot from investors is, especially since now with a bit more volatile regulatory environment, that's not necessarily demanding specific data points. One data point is really looking at 1.5 degree aligned climate transition plans. That's something that investors need and want to be able to make more sustainable and long-term decisions looking at their portfolios. So that's one thing. The other thing is, again, a broken record, but I think it's probably good to play it.
The power of repetition.
Exactly. Is water data, biodiversity, nature data, integrating that in your sustainability strategies. This is something that investors are also increasingly asking for these data points more and more. And also to complement company-level data with product-level data as well, to slowly get an even deeper understanding of how a product actually is affecting the overall system, on top of obviously engaging with companies as well, but having those two pieces work in collaboration with one another.
Interesting. And I think that gives a good perspective of what is also coming our way. And I think CDP has an amazing stance to really get the data on that. And I will keep on following you guys. It's also very interesting to be helping companies with their CDP assessments. And I want to thank you for grounding us in the data, I guess, and seeing where companies are moving towards. So a warm applause for Ariane Colombe joining us for the closing session. Thanks. Thank you, everybody, for joining this session on business within planetary boundaries. I think we touched upon a lot. Planetary boundaries are obviously more than just the science. We talked about how CEOs are actually taking that into account in their strategies. We looked at the data side of it through CDP. And I think there's a lot of work to be done, but also, so as Thomas said, there's obviously a lot to be hopeful about. So I hope you enjoy the rest of Change Now, find each other, chat with each other about these kind of topics, and I hope to see you soon outside there. Thank you.